where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says rolling stones don't gather moss? Hello everyone, I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. Do we have stronger moral obligations to our families and co-citizens than to foreigners of people of other countries? We read and hear about the perilous paths of many immigrants all over the world, from crossing the treacherous borders between Mexico and the US, riding atop freight trains or braving heavy seas packed like sardines in small boats in the hope of reaching stable countries in Europe, or crossing deserts for weeks to reach lands which are considered safe. We sit back and perhaps think about them. They don't feel like us at times. Why? So in this politics of rage, intolerance, power, and consumerism, can we really end global poverty with global governance? What does that even mean in any case? And what is global citizenship? To answer these questions, I have the pleasure of hosting Luis Cabrera, who has charted a long journey from being a cub reporter in the US to being part of one of the most influential global think tanks in the Asia-Pacific region, the Griffith Asia Institute, which is an internationally recognized research center within Griffith Business School. Their research in the field of political science is ranked above world standards. Louis' research is focused on theories and practices of democracy, human rights, and regional and global citizenship. He's authored 3 books on topics and numerous papers, which will help us in answering the questions I posed before. Thank you, Louis, for joining me today.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
And before we go into what you do and why you do take us quickly through a little bit of your life's journey in terms of geography and context to just place everything better. In a small question, by the way, is your name of Italian origin?
I'm Puerto Rican on my father's side, so Cabrera is a very common name in Spanish-speaking countries.
Okay. I was just curious. And just do take us through your life's journey. That was curiosity.
No, it's a big part of my identity, of course. I started, as you mentioned, as a reporter for various small publications and then the Associated Press in Seattle, Washington. And that was a fascinating job. In that job, I got to cover the World Trade Organization protests in 1999. And at that time, that was a very different world. You know, they say the past is a different country, and I think that was a different world in 1999 because you had a lot of academics and a lot of commentators talking about the end of the nation state. Globalization was an unstoppable force, and we just had to find ways to benefit from it and to be part of it. And when the WTO came to Seattle, 50,000 protesters descended from around the world. And much of the message there was we need to be a part of this organization, the decision making this organization is increasingly doing, and organizations like it. If there's going to be a world government, it's got to be a democratic world government. So it seemed that you had many, just sort of mainstream commentators in the media writing columns saying, okay, are we headed toward world government? What would a global democracy look like? How do we make sure that this globalization is representative of people? So I went into academia after that. I decided I wanted to go do a PhD in political science. And the world evolved in front of our eyes as it went. Strangely enough, my work has not really evolved with it. I'm still working on the same things I was before, which is looking at how we might use regional and global organizations to promote individual rights, to promote poverty alleviation, to help people everywhere live more decent lives. And I've written a few books on that. I'm a political theorist, which means I talk about what arguably should happen. But I also am an empirical social scientist. I get out there and talk to lots of people. So I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews. The journalism was very good training for that. So I can walk through my books if that would be of interest.
And thank you for doing that. I think in the next few minutes, when we cross the questions, we will be walking through the books. I went through a few of the details there. What got me interested was also the way you went about it, because I understand that you also, is as part of your research, you also went to the different borders in the US and Mexico borders, and I think you also went to some other places, which I think there were some deserts you also crossed.
That was for the 2010 book. So I've actually conducted field research on every continent now except Antarctica. And there probably aren't a lot of people for me to talk to down there, so that one may just be a visit someday. But for the 2010 book, The Practice of Global Citizenship, I wanted to see if I could develop a coherent theory of global citizenship. The problem with the concept of global citizenship, as people since the famous political theorist Hannah Arendt and many before her have said, is that it's hard to imagine global citizenship in a world where there's no global state. There's no entity capable of setting citizen duties, citizen rights, of making sure that we develop a sense of citizen community. So for them, it's incoherent. It just doesn't work. And I wanted to say, actually, I think there are people who are acting as though it were possible to be a global citizen, or at least enacting aspects of citizenship. So if you break citizenship down into its component parts, sure, we don't have a global passport, but we can certainly enact duties toward one another. We can help to protect the rights of other people. We can cross borders and build a sense of community. So I went out in search of people who seemed to me to be doing that sort of global citizenship action, and also people who were opposing it. So I started with human rights or humanitarian activists on the U.S.-Mexico border in southern Arizona. And, I did participant observer work with a group called No More Deaths. They used to conduct patrols out in the desert where thousands of people had died since the U.S. government started setting a policy of hardening the city crossings, the urban crossings, and effectively driving people out into the desert. So they would do long patrols in the desert looking for people, and they found hundreds and thousands of people over the years, and helped them, just gave them aid. So I worked with them a little while, did a lot of interviews. I worked with interviewed groups such as Humane Borders, which leaves water out along migrant trails. And then I also spent time talking to people in the Minutemen organization, which that's a group of civilian border patrollers. They took it upon themselves to go out to the border and try to help the U.S. Border Patrol. They would spot groups of migrants. They would say, "You've got a group coming over in sector XX, and it looks like there are 12 of them. If you could catch them now." So I was really interested in the kinds of arguments the humanitarian workers would make for the work they were doing, and why it was all right to do that in the face of critiques that they were providing aid and comfort to lawbreakers effectively. And the Minutemen and a lot of other people really saw unauthorized immigrants as people coming to steal from what Americans had developed, true Americans had developed, and taking what wasn't theirs. And also there was this element that you've really heard under Trump about some people being lawbreakers. So I learned a lot on the border. And probably the most important lesson I learned was that the most essential global citizens were unauthorized migrants themselves, people who did not have permission to come into the United States, often Central Americans, but who could offer very coherent, very logical, moral claims for why they felt like they had a right to do it, even though they didn't have permission to do it, even though it meant breaking the law. So they would say, well, my partner is sick, my spouse is sick, there's no way for me to make enough money at home to address this. I need to go. I've got a sick child at home. They would say, my mother needs a roof on her house. And if I go to Arizona or go to Washington, D.C., once I get in the country, I can make $1,200, $1,500 a month, whereas back home I'm going to make far, far less than that. So they would talk about economic needs and say, I feel like I've simply that people need workers like me. I should have a right to go and do that. And under different regimes, they would. So there was that, and then there was also European work. Now, in the European Union, of course, you've got a very different movement regime for people who are citizens of European states. So in the Schengen region, it's visa-free travel for, many states now. I don't remember the exact number. It was 17 when I was looking at it, but I believe it's a few more now. And then it's not visa-free, but it's easy for people from other parts of the European Union to pass through. And there are a lot of, I guess, egalitarian measures in place that were really interesting to me. So I talk in the book about working at the University of Birmingham. I worked there for 7 years in the UK, and being tasked with dividing. We had incoming students, and my job was to say, okay, these are home students, and these are external students. These are international students. And of course, I put all the UK students in the home category, and all the international people from outside the UK in the other. And it was immediately kicked back, and I was told, well, obviously everybody from European Union countries is a home student. It was just a strange thing to think about, because in the United States, at that time, one student from one state would pay triple the fees because they were treated effectively as international students at a state university. I did a lot of research in southern Spain, looking at the same unauthorized immigration tensions. And there you had people coming in and working in the hot houses where they would grow a lot of the produce for Europe. And so I talked to them, I talked to humanitarian workers, I talked to border officials, just trying to get a real sense for the kinds of claims that were being offered on all sides. And from that, I developed this theory of global citizenship, where it's possible to act like a global citizen if you're reaching across borders of citizenship to try to help protect the rights of others.
So I understood where you're going with that. However, I'd like to begin with understanding for the relevance of people who are not in the field to grasp the definition as per you of global citizenship. What does that mean to you? And the reason being that's, again, for the audience, that's one thing. I have been talking to a lot of people across the world at different levels, from all levels, from a monk to Hollywood directors to all kinds of people with different roles that they perform in their lives, different countries and different continents. And it's very interesting that sometimes the reasons that they consider themselves a global citizen is very interesting. It is linked at times to feeling at home in different countries or even global mobility. Now, you are somebody who's been actually getting into the warp and woof of that word and understanding the domain. So, just for a better understanding, what would be your definition?
My overarching aim in my work is to identify ways in which we can make it more possible to actually be regional citizens and global citizens. So for me, the primary purpose of the state and of government and of democracy is to promote and protect individual rights, and in a democracy to enable people to contribute to identifying the rights that they believe they have and to protecting those rights. So as citizens of a state, one of the things we do when we pay our taxes, when we obey the law, when we observe rules, rules of civil society, is support each other in that. We make it possible for rights to be promoted and protected, especially when we pay our taxes and enable good governance, enable government to, we pay for schools that educate children. We pay for healthcare, hopefully, that will help people when they get sick. We pay for the other institutions that make for a decent society. So when I speak in terms of global citizenship and regional citizenship, what I'm looking for are individuals who are acting in ways to help protect the rights of others, just as we would do if we were in decent institutions regionally and globally. Now, I would say that the European Union has come far closer to decent regional institutions of that kind than probably anybody ever expected it to. and certainly than we've ever seen in the world. So in some ways, it's a laboratory. I never call it a model, but it's a laboratory for what might be possible at the regional level, where anybody who's born into the European Union states can expand their own opportunities through movement and taking portable rights with them. So you take the rights of a European citizen with you, and that typically means that you're going to be able to participate politically in meaningful ways. That you'll have a portable pension that will be honored in the country where you move, and that sort of thing. And then you've got other regional organizations, and I've been looking at all the big ones in the last few years. Since 2019, I've visited Mercosur in Latin America, ASEAN several times in Southeast Asia, and then the African Union last year, just to get a sense for how these regional organizations are trying to develop in ways that would help them, that would help their regional citizens protect and promote the rights of each other. And they all do talk these days in terms of regional citizenship. They all address the people of their member states as, Mercosur citizens, ASEAN citizens. African Union is a little different, but certainly they talk about citizens of Africa. And so for me, it comes down to the institutions and to how we might develop the institutions so that we can practice real regional and global citizenship. Now, global obviously is a very long way away. The UN does a lot of good work in the world, but it's probably not going to look like these regional organizations are trying to look anytime, really, because it's a different kind of organization.
Okay, so let me go a little deeper in what you just said. What I understand is in the context in which you are working and how you are defining, it is more about individuals willing to support people of other countries as a part of their normal duty. That, okay, it's not that this is a foreigner and I will not help. I will only help people in my country or my family ends at my doorstep, which is this border here. So that is the context, right? Generally.
There's help and there's not harming. So actually, a lot of what we can do as global citizens is not harming other people, not dumping our environmental damage on other countries, not cracking down on people trying to move for a better life so harshly that you end up killing thousands of them, that sort of thing. So, I would say the Global Citizen Edict is the same as the doctors. First, do no harm.
So we actually, a lot of things would get involved in that, including ethics. So living in an ethical manner. You used a very good example, European Union, and you mentioned ASEAN and the African countries. Now, what if I didn't have to use any words or fancy labels? These are blocks of countries working as a collective or trying to work as a collective. Now, how harmoniously these collectives are working or not with their individual challenges is always a question. You gave a very good example of the European Union, where what I understand is the mobility, of course, with one Schengen visa, one can go from one country to another, but each country would have its own set of laws and rules of governance, etc., their own democracy. So, of course, there would be a European Union, the election, which is, for example, coming up, and there would be individual elections for different countries. Now, we are in a certain geographical zone. We are talking of Italy, Germany, Netherlands, and these kind of countries. Even in these countries, there are a lot of not only geographical differences, but even in the countries, people differ even in language, dialect, the way they interact. A North German will be very different from a South German. A North Italian would be very different from a South Italian, for example. Now, when we are talking of global citizenship, we are trying to cross all borders of culture, religion, language, values, one of the most important which get instilled. So therefore, we have sometimes stereotypes. We have the East and the West and the North and the South. Stereotype was the Eastern people generally like to work as a we. The Westerners try to work very individualistically as I have to look after number one. Having said that, how does that look like? So then it becomes very confusing because we're talking of a whole different ball game of multiple aspects. So how would that work? The idea.
Well, to learn how that might work or how it's being addressed, I had to go to India. So for the last book, which came out in 2020, it was called The Humble Cosmopolitan. And it tries to deal with exactly the kinds of things you're raising. And in fact, it takes on a very challenging critique, which isn't this idea of global citizenship, especially if you institutionalize it and try to set a common set of individual rights that all people should be guaranteed. Isn't that arrogant? Isn't that neo-imperialistic? Isn't that just the West imposing its ideas again? So I wanted to explore that, and I wanted to speak to people who are wrestling with those challenges. So there's a group that you may know in India called the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. And they were of great interest to me because they were trying to press the Indian government to do more on caste discrimination. And this was the early 2000s when Mr. Singh was prime minister. They were reaching out to the UN human rights regime. They were reaching out, they were knocking on the doors of all these international human rights NGOs until some of them would open the door and work with them. And they were trying to get recognition within the UN treaty system that caste discrimination should be considered as covered under the Treaty on Racial Discrimination, which covers other things besides racial discrimination. But a big thrust for them in the early 2000s was trying to get caste discrimination recognized as covered under that. And the Indian government has long resisted that. Because once it's recognized as covered in the treaty, that means that there'd be a lot more pressure on the Indian government. Obviously, the UN can't force a government to do anything, but governments do have to respond once they've bound themselves to these treaties. They're responsible for putting the principles that are in the treaties into their own domestic law. And the Indian government has resisted this. The BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which, is the Hindu nationalist sort of right-wing populist party under Mr. Modi now, always were some of the most vigorous critics. And so I wanted to speak to them as well. So I made about 16 trips to India from 2010 to 2016. Made some very good colleagues, got some initiatives going with colleagues at the University of Delhi, and was able during those processes to also interview a lot of people. So I spent one 6-week trip where I went to, I think it was 10 different Indian cities, all around the country, and interviewing principals from the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. And then a colleague and I interviewed about 20 people from the BJP, officials and party workers. And we really wanted to get their views, especially their views on this international outreach. And of course, what they said about the international outreach really echoed for me, it was fascinating. It really echoed the dialogue at the time of the Indian Constitution being written. So in the 1940s, late 1940s, you've got Dr. Ambedkar, B.R. Ambedkar, the anti-caste champion, the Dalit rights champion, who in the first part of the 20th century, did all these really inspiring things and was picked by Prime Minister Nehru to be the lead drafter of the Constitution. So he's often called the architect or the father of the Constitution. And a lot of the provisions of the Constitution on individual rights reflect the kind of work that he had been doing for a long time. And he had studied at Columbia in New York. He had studied, he got doctorates there and a doctorate at LSE in London. And so he was well-versed in sort of Western rights traditions, which he had also known before he ever left India from Mahatma Phule, who was a champion of the lower castes in the 19th century, early 20th century. And he'd been a great influence on Ambedkar. So Ambedkar had these universalist rights ideas because he would say that's the only way Dalits are going to get justice in India, because when he looked into Hinduism, he didn't find any purchase there, at least not at first, for Dalits being able to press their own claims to be able to be treated the way they wanted to be treated. So the point here would be that when he brought out the Constitution, the right-wing Hindu nationalists at the time, including one who later shot and killed Mahatma Gandhi, said this is a Western constitution. All these individual rights, where's Village Raj? This is not our constitution. They wanted a Hindu constitution inflected with Hindu principles. So India has been the site of this kind of universalism versus what you might call parochialism, a very influential, very powerful group within the country that would like to see Hindu principles in place in all the governing institutions. In much the same way, many people these days are trying to put Christian principles in place in the United States. So it was fascinating for me to talk to all these people and to get insights from the Dalit activists on how they invoked universals and how they said, no, these are human rights. These are for everybody. We're not a country, we're a democracy. We're India, but we're not just a Hindu India or an upper caste Hindu India. We're also, for the lower castes. And they didn't work very much with Muslims, but I also talked with Muslim activists, who would obviously say India's for Muslims too. India's for everybody. So those kinds of tensions were really instructive to me as I was trying to develop an argument for what an institutionalized global citizenship would look like that would actually enable people to press their rights, but would also enable a rich dialogue about the rights that people should have in the place of religion.
That's interesting, actually. So that you're trying to find that out. Actually, I had a conversation with somebody a few months back, and something came out, as you said, about the constitution and the rights and the belief system there. There is what you're currently working on, the global citizenship. Originally, also in India, it was believed, since we are talking about India, there is this line which says, Vasudeva Kutumbakam. I'm not saying it's probably in the right way, but so the world is one in a way. I had this dialogue also last year with a renowned monk about diversity, universal consciousness, and one individual consciousness. And there it was also, we'll come to that, about cosmopolitanism, for example, we discussed. Very interesting. He drew up something similar to what you are saying. So at the end, what we gather is there also right now, the clarity is still not there. There is diffusion. It is still work in progress.
What I ended up arguing was that Dr. Ambedkar gives us a lot of guidance on how to develop a constitution and or at least a set of constitutional principles that we could try to promote in the world, under which everybody's voice could be heard. So it looks like a liberal democracy. It looks like a constitutional democracy, very much like the one that he helped give to India, where it's a secular constitution of the kind that Nehru and Gandhi were so interested in seeing put in place, which means, of course, that it's not meant to reflect any particular religious persuasion. And it is meant to enable every voice to be heard, ideally, and every group to be able to press its own interests in the public sphere. And while that may look like, I think it looks like India. So one might say it looks Western, but if you look to the West, a lot of the Western democracies are not fully secular. And I think many of them are becoming less secular over time. The United States, if if Donald Trump wins again, will very likely go much more in that Christian direction. And I'm not sure what that exactly would look like. But I think the Indian experiment gives us a good idea of what it could look like. And it also gives us a good idea these days of the dangers of parochialism. As we've seen, what some call the saffronization of India under Mr. Modi, where the BJP has continually pressed, everything from textbooks in school to policies, to banning the consumption of beef and all the sorts of things that are Hindu principles, banning things that Hindu nationalists would take to offend Hindus, and pressing their aim to make India look much more like a Hindu, where it's a Hindu Raj, a Hindu nation. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. Now, will that slow? Will that be reversed somewhat? Since Mr. Modi didn't do incredibly well in the last elections, the BJP, appears to have lost quite a bit of ground. We'll see. But I think what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is the Hindu nationalist parochialist program really being successful in India, really being pushed there.
Okay, so leading on from there, another question. When countries get into trouble, a lot of them try to handle it themselves. And there are some sects or sections which try to reach out to them, some other countries to seek help. And when help comes from another country, and usually it's the big brother US, then other people then say, but this is our internal matter. How is another country involved? How can they even understand what is happening? They are, of course, they have vested interest. Now, where does this conversation go there in this example?
I think it's a good question. And I think it points us to why it's important to have at least a more disinterested set of institutions. So when the United States is moved to spend its treasure and especially the blood of its people, the blood of its soldiers at times in a foreign conflict, usually the first question people would ask is, what's in it for the United States? Why are they doing this? Why are they pressing it? When the UN intervenes with peacekeepers, which it's done 80 or more times, over the decades here, it is viewed usually as more of a neutral actor that is intervening because to try to stop the bloodshed or to try to keep the parties apart after there's been a ceasefire. And I think that's a principle that we can see that it's not absolute neutrality, but it is more a principle of disinterest where the UN is not perceived to have a vested, the UN's not going to benefit by intervening. So, sometimes when the US intervenes, especially if it's an oil rich country, something like that, the critique is always, oh, you're just there for the oil and you're really going to you're going to capture all the resources before you leave and that sort of thing. So I think any country, whether it's the US, whether it's China coming with a big loan to create a port that will benefit China, whether it's Russia doing what it does, any powerful country, you look and you question its motives. You are going to have, no institution is perfect. I mean, every nation state is rife with problems. This is what politics is. But I think when you've got the organizations, they've got less of a vested interest in pushing, and they've got more of an interest in promoting regional development, promoting a good life for everyone insofar as they can. And often they're quite limited in being able to do that. But one of the things I would note about the African Union, for example, which is often very limited in the resources it can deploy, but they've just signed into, or they just enacted the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which should provide many, many, many opportunities for economic development in countries that really want the economic development. And so that's the kind of thing, when the African Union is doing it, it might be viewed as more neutral than, say, when China or the United States are coming to a country and competing to try to build the next big plant that's going to extract natural resources.
Going on from there, another thought. I remember one of my guests was Erik Solheim, the former foreign minister of Norway, who had done a lot of peace building efforts in Sudan and between the East and West, a lot of work he's doing. That was something very interesting when I asked about global citizenship. So it's actually very interesting when I get people's opinions and how they think. So, for example, in his opinion, global citizenship, we are really far way off from that because human beings are typically tribal. If I hope I've got that term right in context, I will have to check back, but tribal in nature that they look after their own first. So I look after my family and my country. So my family will come first in my region and so on. And then comes something else. Now that feeling is very different. And for example, in the US, at the end of generally leaders would, without naming any, leaders would end a speech with "Long live America" or "God bless America," and every person from their country not every person, largely would people, the leaders try to lead them to believe my nation is the best because it has this history or that history, or somebody else did this and that, and we are proud of that, and my country is the best, which means other countries are rotten or whatever. But so it's always one against the other. So in my mind, again, in the context of, if I'll try to elaborate so that you catch my thought, in the age of competition that we live in across the world, which is increasing, people are being led to look out for number one. So forget about the family and the community or the tribe or the state. People are busy looking after number one because they are threatened by number two, which is a second person right next door, for example. So this kind of competition, which begins very early in schools, in colleges, is very, in my opinion, deterrent to the feeling of we are one. We have to look out for everyone. I also feel that in the age that we are living in, the very fact that the UN has sustainable development goals, and not only the UN, it is trickled down to organizations, institutions, countries across the world. However, exactly the way one is living, the values by which we are living now, be it the East or the West, it actually completely defeats the purpose. The more you look out for number one, you cannot look out for the earth and keep saying, I'm I'm in for climate change. You can't, because you are looking out for number one. So that is superficial talk. So having said that, what do you think? What is your opinion?
No, I think you've hit it. That's anytime we're talking about building bigger communities, we're going to face that. So anytime we're talking about how do we, and I think the real question is, let's look at how we did that. How did we move past family clans so that different families felt like they could come together in community and consider themselves a broader community? How do we come from those communities, let's call them villages, to cities? How do we come from cities to states? States where sometimes people don't speak the same language, and yet they come to view, they're told repeatedly over and over again that no, you're part of the same country. Some countries have hundreds of different languages. I mean, Indonesia has so many different languages, and yet they all have come to be able to consider themselves part of the same country. I think we look at that and we say, "Wow, how did that happen?" Then we look at these ridiculous miracles. I would say miracle. I would say a miracle of politics, because it really shouldn't have been possible for the European Union to put, almost 30 countries together, and suddenly, while they don't feel like they're the same country, suddenly all of their taxes are crossing borders to support development in what the European Union designates as the regions within countries that need it most. When I was in the UK, it was still part of the European Union, and there would be regions of the UK that were designated as ones that should receive European Union development funds, and that was coming from other countries. How did that possibly happen? How were people willing to put up with people moving from Poland, moving from the UK to Spain, and just living and working there as though it were their country? How did that happen in Mercosur? Because Mercosur also has free movement, not only for its 4 member states, but also from, I think it's at least 9 total member states. All of its associate members also have free movement, and that's meant a lot of people moving a lot of places. And so I think we look at how those things happen, and I think they happen because they make economic sense. Sometimes they make political sense. The U.S. started pursuing NAFTA maybe as part of competitive globalization because China was rising and becoming more powerful. NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement that opened up a lot of trade between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The European Union was on the rise. These are some of the reasons they happen. But for me, I think there's a really interesting story here that we really should tell, and I'm going to tell it in the next book. And a big part of the next book is actually on world government. And there's a section early on in the book where I talk about going to all these regional organizations and going to the UN and talking to them. And it's called In Search of the Shadow World Government. Because what we've got these days is the sort of system that dreamers and visionaries and radicals have had for hundreds of years. And, they said, they draw these blueprints for the world government, especially from the 1930s onward, 1930s, 1940s. All these people are drawing up blueprints for the world government. They were very disappointed when all we got was the United Nations. And they would say, and the world will have 11 regions, and the capital city of this region will be Delhi, and the capital city over here will be Sao Paulo or whatever it might be. And then there were others who dreamed of European Union. So my favorite story of that is about a man named Gargas, who had been a petty criminal. He was a galley slave, which, he was on one of the prison ships in the Seine. And when he was released, he showed up one night on Ben Franklin's doorstep. Benjamin Franklin, at that time serving as a diplomat for the United States to France in Paris. And he lived outside of Paris, and just one night, this knocking on his door, and it was this ragged man holding a manuscript. And it was Gargas, and it was a manuscript for European Union. And Franklin was so taken by him and so interested in that he ended up publishing it. He was a printer. That was his trade. So he printed it, and it was circulated in a small way. It didn't make much of a splash, but now it's getting more and more attention. But the point would be that all of these dreamers have, envisioned this fantasy of European Union. And, how could you possibly have these states that have been warring with one another for hundreds and hundreds of years, and, that were melded from smaller principalities that were at war, kingdoms that were at war with each other? How is this possibly able to be envisioned? And yet it happened. Here we are. Maybe it took World War II, and, let's not have another one of those. But I think we look at these entities as laboratories, and we work backward from there. We say, how was this possible? Knowing what we know about how this was possible, how might something even more be possible? But I take a very long timeline. I think, anything that would look like what people would call a world government would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years off. I mean, we've got to solve right-wing populism and a few other problems first, I think.
That was, wisely said. I also think so. In fact, if I had to say it in one line, it would be, after listening to you also, till we see ourselves as human beings, as part of one world, till that time happens, and rightly, as you rightly said, global citizens, till that time, wars will continue, because it is always about one and the other. There's always this aspect of the other, a foreigner or another country, or I'm better than the next one. So till that happens, I think wars will continue, and the problems of, even in my humble opinion, when people sit down at different tables across the world in the largest global organizations and talk about climate change, how can that happen when the actions belie the values? The largest countries may come, and they are the ones who might be causing pollution, for example.
It's a fair point, and I think one of the things we could do also is look within countries and look at who tends to oppose things like climate change. And I'm not a radical, big state socialist / communist, anything like that. But I think if you just an interested observer will notice that it tends to be the political parties on the right that are most resistant to strong action on climate change, and especially the right-wing populist political parties, for the most part, not categorically. But, Donald Trump is the one who's going to kill whatever agreement there might be possible on climate change if he gets reelected. It will be leaders like that. So there are leaders in the center and leaders more on the center left who are very interested in dealing with climate change, in pressing solar and all the other things that might be able to replace fossil fuels. moving to electric cars. And I think if we look at that consistent rhetoric, then we begin to say, yes, there's something about the nation state system, because you're right, you don't get any points as a politician for saying Canada is the most wonderful country in the world if you live in the United States, right? That doesn't get you elected. You say, you are the greatest citizens of the world. This is the greatest country, and I'm going to fight for your interests. I'm not going to fight for the interests of Canadians. Yes, there is that, but there's also, I think, a sensible strain political leader, a bureaucrat, where they say, if we don't deal with things like climate change and in an earlier generation nuclear weapons, we're all going to suffer, and it's going to, and people are going to die in increasing numbers, and really, really bad things are going to happen. So actually, we've got to solve this collective action problem. We've got to find a way to overcome our natural instinct towards selfishness and create a collective initiative that can really address this. And that's why we have government too. I mean, government is simply trying to solve collective action problems. We used to all fight each other. Everybody used to carry a gun. The way they do in some places in my home country these days. But it's government assumes for itself the right to have the monopoly on coercion, on collective coercion. That's why police are supposed to have the guns and to suppress the wrongdoing. If everybody has a gun, then everyone feels the right to shoot at each other whenever they want to. But if we have laws about, if we have laws and they're enforced by people with guns, and the people with guns have proper oversight too, then that's trying to solve a collective action problem. Climate change is the biggest collective action problem we have right now.
True, including global poverty. You mentioned that you went to different blocks of countries, including Africa. So there's an example which came up in my mind just now when we were talking of democracy. In every country, democracy is practiced in different ways. And another one of my guests had mentioned, which I didn't know because I've not been to Africa and, actually been and seen how they work. And it was very interesting. He had an observation that when one goes down to each of these countries and sees how democracy is practiced without actually bringing assumptions that the way I practice democracy in my country is the West way, one sees how in each of these places through ancient times, it is being practiced to a very beautiful level where everybody's voice is being heard, and till the last voice is heard, a vote is not taken. A final decision, so to say, is not taken. I was surprised. I didn't know that. And then he also mentioned that, and then come along countries, larger countries, with more economic power. Right now, economic power is generally considered power, unfortunately. So when another country of larger economic power comes along and says, hey, you need to practice democracy in my way, this is not called democracy. So in your travels and your research, what did you see and what is your opinion?
I would not. I've only been to Africa once. I was in Addis Ababa to talk to people around the African Union summit. But I was struck by some of the different views that I heard. And so one gentleman who's had been a very senior official in the African Union and came from a small country in Africa where he was describing the kind of dynamics you were describing, where you've got a system of governance where everybody gets a voice and that sort of thing. And then I was speaking to a woman who's been an activist for a long time for women's causes and women's rights. And she was saying, you'll hear that a lot. But then when you really start poking at it, women's voices were often excluded. The voices of many other people were excluded, and we just haven't been heard. And that's why the kind of work we're doing is so important. So I don't pretend to have the answer, but certainly there are different views around that in the dialogue. And that's one of the reasons I try to seek out as many views as I can to get a better sense. But I hope to go back to talk to people around the Pan-African Parliament in Johannesburg early next year and learn a bit more about that.
It's interesting because as I hear more There's another light which comes, and another window opens, and another conversation unfolds. There are three words which are moved around: global citizenship, cosmopolitanism, and world citizenship. How are they different from each other?
The arguments I've made just in the political theory literature has been that global citizenship is the completion of cosmopolitanism. So cosmopolitanism is a moral theory that says that we should treat everyone's interests as though they mattered equally. Now that can be played out in a lot of different ways. It doesn't mean that I have to give, if I give my child a pair of shoes, I have to give everybody's child a pair of shoes. Because that wouldn't be a very efficient economic system. What it probably means on the ground is that we should aim toward a system where every child is able to get a pair of shoes, and we should treat, and that's what it would mean by treating all interests equally. That's the kind of world we should aim for. And what I say is that global citizenship is necessary to complete cosmopolitanism, because if we really want to aim for that world where everyone's interests would be treated equally well, as in the way that you expect a decent government to look after all of its citizens, then we need something like real concrete global citizenship, where we've got institutions in which we're global citizens. So that's how I see them combined. And world citizenship, I would say, for me, would be the same as global citizenship. And a couple of times I wanted to note, you've hit on a distinction that theorists talk about, which is sort of a community sense of global citizenship, where people feel like they're part of one world, and they aim toward promoting that feeling. And then there's the more institutional sense of global citizenship, where you try to develop institutions where you could actually practice something like real global citizenship or regional citizenship as well, leading to the global. And I think the two have to go together. And they'll be mutually reinforcing. And at certain times, I don't know what your perspective is, but I've been very interested in the support that I've seen young people giving really across the world to the Palestinians, as the Palestinian civilian populations, as Israel has really vigorously pressed this war. And I haven't studied it enough to be able to draw any firm conclusions, but it certainly seems to me a site of potential investigation. Why has this particular conflict captured the imagination of so many young people, and why are so many of them so willing to take such robust action in support of the Palestinians and trying to achieve a ceasefire? And I think that's an example of that sort of sentiment that crosses borders. So I think it's very interesting, and it's the latest. There have been a lot of them.
Actually, it was very interesting for me also. I recently had a panel. Very wonderful. For me, it was incredulous. I could not imagine that the young generation, which is there right now, I feel that we are leaving the earth in safe hands. When I talk of the young generation, after listening to these very brave people, they were people representing the MENA region. They are doing incredible work across 130 countries for peace. And one of the gentlemen, was a young 23-year-old person who actually had been in the genocide zone in the Gaza Strip for 45 days during that time. What was very interesting is the views which I got after that as well. The feeling of hope these people still have. And there is one line I can tell you which sort of sums up the whole thing, why they are doing what they are doing. We stand in solidarity for all humans. And they were also saying that the people in Palestine, they were crying when till a long time, they did not know that the world is standing up for them. There are people in different parts of the world who don't know them, in a very different geography, and they are standing up for them because they are humans and they feel for them. And the moment they realized, when the social media started filtering in, the moment they realized that, it gave them hope. they started crying that they are not alone. And that feeling sort of was a dominoes effect. It started spreading. What I understood after this conversation was there are a lot of students who are protesting who actually have no idea of Palestine, or they're not even Palestinians. They are general normal people of their country, and they're protesting just about the idea, which for me is a sign of hope in many ways. Just an example that people can feel other people's pain in different geographies. And that for me is a very good sign of human values. Now that brings me to the next part. I'm glad. Thank you for bringing that up, because I was wanting to mention another part very related to global citizenship, which in my head is a bit of rounding up. And I would like your opinion on that, because you rightly described before we spoke just now. You said, I'm putting the feeling as we are part of one world is one aspect, and the global governance is another aspect. And the two have to work together for this idea to happen in a very mature way. And I totally agree with you. Having said that, again, in my humble opinion, when we work on the outer envelope, we cannot bring out so much changes in the inner. When we begin from the inner and go to the outer, we are talking of solid changes. Therefore, when we say, what is your opinion? Let me word it differently. What is your opinion when we say we work on developing compassion, human values, understanding and intercultural non-violent communication, and arrive at a possibility of global governance? Because till that happens, we are forcing an idea. But the moment we develop compassion, we open ourselves, talk of human values, we are automatically going global. In a way, we are removing boundaries from between people. And then we talk about intercultural, we are trying to open up even more awareness, attitude, and try to understand. And when we understand the language of non-verbal, let's say non-violent communication, we are trying to put something across in another person's language. I'm not talking of dialect and so on, so that we're looking at a global understanding. And then global governance comes to make sure that it happens. What do you think of that?
I think compassion is a good one to think about, a good emotion to think about, emotion slash virtue. And I would say that when I was on the border, one of the things I was struck by was that all of the, as you might expect, the humanitarian workers had compassion. That was their motivation. They all expressed, almost all, expressed some feeling that these are human beings. They're suffering. They're in pain. I simply feel like I have a duty to help if I can. People are dying in the desert. They need water. If I can get somebody water, if I can get them medical aid, then that's what I feel like I have a duty to do. The people who were trying to, in some cases, stop that work, but certainly trying to help prevent people from crossing the border, I would say were certainly not motivated by compassion. They were motivated by a sense of patriotism and solidarity with their own country. And that often led to what seemed to me to be a lack of compassion for the other, a lack of empathy, a lack of willingness or ability to be able to see through the eyes of the other. I remember one gentleman saying to me that he expressed some compassion. He said, "Yeah, he was a civilian border patroller. I've seen babies, this small out here being carried by their parents." And he expressed sympathy for the babies, but then in the same breath, he turned around and said, "But I think the parents basically are shouldn't be doing that, and if they're caught, they should be put away, like anybody else." And just not a sense that maybe there was another side to that, and maybe there's another way to think about mobility regimes in a region like North America. But I think first it takes an enlargement of compassion to be able to see through the eyes of the other and to be able to see people as actual people. And what we're seeing right now with President Biden just issuing an edict, an order that trying to quote unquote shut down the border and halt refugee intake or applications, asylum seeker applications, is it's very much in line with the non-compassionate responses, and I think is going to be very problematic. So yes, how do we develop compassion then? How do we encourage compassion? Well, it starts in the schools. It starts with policies that are not so mean-spirited, politics that are not so mean-spirited. I think we really, really have to do all we can to get past this really vitriolic, divided, populist moment. Mr. Trump is incredibly good at what he does, and what he does is stir up sentiment against the other. And he's got a lot of others who he would like to target. And I think he is probably just the best at doing that, but a lot of right-wing politicians around the world are really adept at doing that. And hopefully that will have its moment very soon, and we can move more toward a civil politics, more toward a politics of compassion, where we can take people's interests better into account. I would say that's the struggle of our age right now.
I totally agree there, and with the thought process. And I totally agree with what you said about it begins in schools and with the young ones. At home and in school is where everything begins. And when we say at home, that next generation is going to be, again, the parents to the next ones. So two things, in my opinion, home and school. In what I see, which then I get afraid what is happening, even in our generation and the one before. We are taught chemistry, geography, history, all the stuff. Yet kids nowadays are not taught about the geography of their own minds and intellect and the emotions, the insights. So when they don't have the capability to grasp the inside, at some point, they adhere to the tenets of success, what the world is pointing out to them. This is success. This border is here, that, and so and so. However, when a challenge comes, that challenge calls for stability in the inner core and an understanding of a person's emotions and strong values. When those are missing, they break and then they look for help. And what I see across the world, whether it's the East or the West, in different degrees, is it is happening at a younger and a younger age. And therefore, what you said, I feel hits the core. It has to begin early. When we are talking of compassion, it is not relegated to a spirit. We are all spiritual. Again, my opinion, we are human. We are spiritual beings leading a human existence. So having said that, till we get our inner act together, we cannot go to the next one, because the next one, for example, for the moment is just like an envelope, a balloon which bursts very quickly, and then we look out for the next one. What has surprised me in the last 5 years is I've been observing changes in development in all sides of the globe. And I've been surprised. Of course, consumerism is catching up everywhere, even to the hinterlands, in a wrong way. When we speak of industrialization, there are pros and cons. Again, in a wrong, so everything needs to have a guideline, but begin from the core. So I'm very happy with what you said, the schools. If we could begin with compassion, values, global governance, global citizenship, the understanding of it, that at the school level, we are really raising well-educated society, which has the capacity to look after the other. So
we've got excellent role models out there as well. I mean, the two who have really inspired me. Well, Martin Luther King. Every person who went to school of my generation and later generations in the United States actually spent a lot of time studying Martin Luther King at various times. He was, he's quite a national hero. And he did preach compassion. He preached nonviolence. And also toward the end of his life, he became a more conscious cosmopolitan. He started, opposing the Vietnam War and talking about how we could be effectively more cosmopolitan in the world. And then other people who are really inspiring in terms of promoting a compassionate message. Certainly Mahatma Gandhi has got to be up there on anyone's list. And one of the things I've been writing about recently and learning more about is the world government advocacy by Gandhi and Nehru. And Nehru saw world government as a vehicle by which Gandhi's message could be better spread in the world. And Gandhi was also very supportive of world government. They consistently said it. They put it in the Quit India resolution that got them all put in jail when they said they wouldn't help Britain fight in World War II because it wouldn't offer independence. And they said it in many other places. And there's been some interesting work lately about how Gandhi's message of compassion and nonviolent struggle fed into the idea that there should be a world government that would promote decent interrelations between all states, that would end imperialism, that would end colonialism, and enable all states to take their place and all peoples to take their place. So I find that very inspiring, and I think we have a lot of role models like that. There were a lot of women thinkers in the 1940s on up who were offering that kind of message. And I think we're talking about them in academia. We talk about them a little bit in public spaces like this. And I think the more we talk about them and the more we keep that dialogue going, the farther these ideas can spread. It takes a long time for ideas to spread, but there's some good ones out there.
Yep, thank you for that. I'll just add one more name to that list that you said. So glad you mentioned Martin Luther King. And incidentally, I had a very interesting conversation with somebody who worked with Martin Luther King as well. Worked alongside. It was a very interesting conversation. You mentioned Mahatma Gandhi, and a third person in the context of what we are talking, global citizenship and cosmopolitanism. Very interesting person, Swami Vivekananda. And when he went to Chicago and he spoke of the East and West. And what I didn't know was that one line which was mentioned by a monk, very renowned monk later, was that he had said, the day the East and West come together in one person, that day the earth will be one. We're talking of global citizenship. And very interesting idea. Imagine at that time in 1800, somewhere 64, I think. I'm not sure the exact year. But I realized that these realized souls, so to say, had exactly similar thoughts, putting them out in different points of time and centuries that we are living through. And we hope to see more to come. Thank you so much, Louis, for joining me today. It has been a wonderful dialogue.
Great questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.